Um, I'm glad to meet you. I mean, finally. Um, well, I'm actually going to talk about the world during and above all after this pandemic. But I thought it might be of some minor interest to you to hear about a few words of why I became a social scientist and what is driving me in my work. And those drives can be summarized in two words: rebellion and curiosity. Rebellion, above all, against the arrogance of power and privilege, against what I have in my scholarly work analyzed as existential inequality, against disrespect and humiliation in all forms and in all places. The main forms are well known nowadays: patriarchy and sexism, racism, imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, which is not only an economic system, but also, and arguably foremost, the ruthless power of capital hunting for profit. My first rebellion, apart from the common reaction against paternal authority, was against imperialism. With increasing understanding and anger, I followed from age 13 popular struggles against imperialism, from the French war against Vietnam in the early 1950s to the American war and beyond. Growing up, my vista of the injustices of the world widened. I became increasingly curious to find out why there was so much inequality and exploitation in the world. So that's why I decided to study social science. Curiosity has then carried me from one topic to another, from the historical worldviews of the social sciences, the rule of the ruling class, the power of ideology, the differential production of unemployment, the rights of children, the historical construction of Europe, the development of family, sex, gender relations in the world of the 20th century, the rise and the erosion of capitalist democracy, the dimensions of inequality, cities as manifestations of power, etc. My horizon has almost always been the world, ever since my interest in the Korean War, age 9, listening to the radio news. I've even written a book called The World, trying to lay bare the cultural geology which has made us what we are today. The intertwining of the local and the global has been a persistent theme of my investigations. So curiosity about the world and rebelling against its injustices and inequalities have provided me with energy long after institutional retirement. End of autobiography, now for the world and its future. The COVID-19 pandemic will be a landmark of world history, primarily because of its planetary simultaneity and because of its geopolitical and social effects, which have had more impact than its contagion and its mortality. The pandemic has been and is an experience of suffering and loss for millions of people around the planet. For us privileged survivors, it has been a life-engraving learning experience. It has shown us the historical impact of contingency, the planetary commons and its eradicable divisions, a sharpening of social and political alternatives, and an acceleration of the current dynamic of the world towards ever more inequality and privileges for the few, and towards a post-Western century, possibly even to a US-China war. The pandemic experience is one of differential vulnerability and unequal outcomes. The coronavirus and its management are operating as amplifiers of prevailing social divides and tendencies. Divides of age, ethnicity, gender, and class have been magnified. The rich are becoming richer, and the poor poorer. The fortunate are becoming more fortunate, and the unfortunate are becoming more miserable. Upon the existing class structure, a new binary structuration is imposed. Among the owners and executives of capital, there is a new sectoral divide. For example, in the first 7 months of this year, the stocks of the 5 big tech corporations, Apple, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Facebook, rose by 37%. That is, making their owners, among them the richest men on earth, 37% richer in 7 months. Whereas the share of all the others on the Standard & Poor list of 500 US corporations declined by 6%. And many smaller businesses are going bankrupt. Among employees, there is an upper middle class who are able to keep their job, their safety, and their salary by working from home. Employees with the highest salaries have the lowest risk of unemployment. Then there is an essential service class caring for, feeding, and protecting the more privileged classes and for their parents. And in some countries also to some extent for the less privileged. These people have to work harder than ever. They get their income, but little safety, instead running big risks of becoming infected. Then we have the ordinary working class, which is also sliced up into two. On the one side, there are workers with formerly a full-time stable job, now often unemployed, but furloughed with a 20 to 40% cut of their income if they're lucky to be Europeans, or receivers of some kind of unemployment compensation. And then at the bottom, you have the previous temporary workers in the global north and the so-called informal rightsless workers in the south who have lost their livelihood, although they may get some public help. For the rest, they have to ask for charity. And in mid-July, 1 in 7 of US households with children reported insufficient food. Insufficient food in the United States. Think of that. The closing of schools and recourse to remote education divide children between those with or without functioning internet and with or without helpful, highly educated parents. A divide that may mark a generation. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the recent decline of extreme poverty is being reversed into a big increase. Because of its simultaneous global character, the COVID-19 pandemic is probably the largest unequalizer in modern history. It is everywhere driving intranational inequality. But its effects on international inequality remain to be measured up. By the end of the second quarter of 2020, by July 1st, the largest economic losses compared to 2019 were suffered in India, with the GDP down 24%, and in Spain and the UK minus 22% each, whereas China stood at a 3% growth, and Vietnam and Bangladesh were also on plus. However, it's already clear that the chasm between the world's rich and poor households has widened even further. The first and most obvious lesson of the pandemic is the fragility of human civilization. Even at high age, high age is my personal experience. Civilization, even at high levels of productivity and consumption, and with technological skills capable even of entering and supplementing the human brain. But by industrial animal husbandry and by the destruction of many animal habitats, humanity has become closer and more exposed to the viral world with its limitless supply of malign viruses. This microscopic viral experience arrives as we are about to learn the macroscopic forces of a wounded planet, the consequences of climate change, which are reminding us of their existence in these days, with massive flooding in Africa and Asia, with aggressive wildfires in Australia, California and Oregon, and with the melting Arctic and Antarctic. The second hard lesson is the political vulnerability of human solidarity and the dysfunctionality of the current geopolitics of states. In the national panics of late March and early April, old international cooperation and alliances suddenly meant nothing, as borders were suddenly closed. Even between the Nordic countries, which have been in the passport union since 1952, movements of paid-for protective goods, protective gear within the European Union were stopped temporarily, though nevertheless. And NATO allies, United States and France, were competing for protective gear on the tarmac of airports in Bangladesh and in Paris. At the level of policy, there are about two lessons above all. First, the health of populations depend crucially on alert and knowledgeable governments with strong public health care systems. Two groups of countries were relatively successful in coping with a viral attack because of early, well-orchestrated interventions. On the one hand, the epidemic experienced strong and digitally highly skilled developmental states of East Asia, and the foresighted, well-organized Nordic welfare states, except Sweden, my own country, which blew it. Privatizations have turned out a drain and a weakness. Private old age homes became houses of death under the pandemic in a number of countries. Private capital accumulation had no interest in storing protective equipment, nor in developing vaccines or tests for popular diseases. Another lesson is that developed states, another policy lesson, is that developed states, in the current context of low inflation and low interest rates, have discovered their enormous economic capacity to borrow and to print money. We have seen that in the face of the pandemic, there were suddenly ample public resources of support available. And even in countries like Trumpist USA and Bolsonaro Brazil, not only for business bailouts, but also for unemployment compensation. Tory austerity was demonstrated not being an economic constraint, but an ideological right-wing option, now suddenly becoming passé. The world after Corona will be angry, more divided, and an increasingly post-Western world. There will be much anger over the losses and inequalities of the pandemic and over the incompetence and arrogance of many governments. What form and direction this anger will take is impossible to predict, however, due to the fact of the fractured multidimensionality of post and pre-industrial politics. There are hardly any large programmatically egalitarian movements and parties around, so the field is open for all kinds of political entrepreneurs, not excluding committed egalitarians though. The world after Corona will no longer be a world of neoliberal globalization and of unchallenged US and Western supremacy and domination. This was something in the air after the millennium turn, when the rise of China and other countries meant that international inequality began to bend down for the first time since the Industrial Revolution and after the Western 2008 financial crisis. But 2020 will probably be remembered as the year of a geopolitical tipping point. The pandemic laid bare the weakness of the Western powers in handling the crisis, both in terms of health and in economic terms, in comparison with China and also with the rest of East Asia. By September 11 this year, the death toll per million inhabitants from COVID-19 was 3 in China, and ranging in East Asia from 0.3 in Taiwan, 0.4 in Vietnam, to 11 in Japan. Whereas the US mortality rate was 593, approaching 200 times higher than the Chinese. And mortality among the biggest European allies of the United States ran between 112 in Germany and 612 in the UK, and counting in all these 3 cases. Contagion tests were available in Sierra Leone, one of the poorest countries on earth, before the US, according to the humanitarian expert Nicola Kristof in the New York Times today, or yesterday. Economically, according to mid-September OECD estimates, alone among the large G20 economies, China is growing in 2020 by about 2%, while the US will decline by about 4%, the Eurozone by about 8%, and the UK by about 10%. In frustration over his own failures, the United States abdicated from cooperative world leadership by leaving the WHO in the midst of the pandemic, as it had already done with respect to cooperation on climate change. And instead, it declared economic and ideological war against China. The outcome of that is still open, but it means the end of the post-World War II economic Pax Americana. Pandemic experience is providing the triggering context for an economic and ideological war in gestation, once it became obvious that China was becoming a big power without becoming a second USA. After the pandemic, a post-Western century is likely to emerge. US military and economic domination will not go away anytime soon, but the world hegemony is slipping, and the 21st century will see the big Asian elephants enter the center stage of the world. China and India, each with a population 4 times that of the US, Indonesia 3 times that of Germany, and then there are 4 other developing Asian countries more populous than Germany. To follow this epochal shift will be a fascinating experience for curious citizens of the world, as well as for social scientists, but also a cognitive and civic challenge. The new Cold War has already started, and it will have its generous share of prejudice, deliberate disinformation, and ideological distortion. There will be great pressure to conform to the Western or to the Eastern side. And many journalists, scholars, and politicians will enroll enthusiastically as warriors. For those who don't want to enroll, particular cognitive efforts, skepticism, and vigilance will be needed. The US-China conflict will pose great problems for the climate movement, subverting the chances of planetary climate agreements. And the US-China war would be disastrous for the planet, hindering necessary concerted planetary action, even if the war were to be militarily limited. Therefore, the climate movement will have to become also a neutralist peace movement. How the pandemic will end is still unknown. Will it be defeated or will it have to be accommodated? What shape will the economic recovery take? A V, a U, or an L, or a K? In other words, a rapid return to pre-existing so-called normalcy, a slow recovery, or a prolonged recession? Or will it be an extra socially polarized recovery between the upper side and the lower side of the K, added on to the pandemic polarization of the world? In any case, because of its unique planetary grip, the corona pandemic will become a historical landmark, meaning that there will be an important after as well as a before. Western North Atlantic history has two previous compressed such after moments. 1932, after the outbreak of the still continuing 1929 to 31 depression, or 1945, after the end of World War II. 1919-20 is another candidate for an important after moment after World War I. But its most dramatic outcomes, parliamentary democracy with universal or male suffrage for some countries, national independence for some, and socialist revolutions in at least one big country, and none of them likely to be central in post-COVID-19. So we leave the 1920. We have the two options or two scenarios, which we remember historically as 1932 and 1945. In the early stages of the pandemic, 1945 looked like a possible end, at least in some parts of the Americas and Europe. Neoliberal marketization and privatization obviously could not cope. And there was reformist optimism in the air. On April 3, the editorial board of the Financial Times declared, quote, "Radical reforms are required to forge a society that will work for all. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. They must see public services as investment rather than liabilities, and look for ways to make labor markets less insecure. Redistribution will again be on the agenda. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix," unquote. The founder and director of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Klaus Schwab, is expecting, after the various, I quote, "a period of massive wealth redistribution from the rich to the poor and from capital to labor." This is the founder of the Business Forum in Davos. And he also expects, quote, the death knell to neoliberalism. But he also adds that this what he calls optimistic scenario will come only after, quote, massive social turmoil, unquote. The progressive reform outlook is reminiscent of the overwhelming rejection of miserly pre-Keynesian conservatism and liberalism in 1945. Von Hayek's idea then that the social democratic welfare state would be, as he called it, a road to serfdom was ridiculous, and so have been contemporary claims of neoliberalism come to be. A better, more egalitarian world seemed possible, seriously confronting the threats of climate warming with public health and old age care for all, an educational system which gave all pupils and students an equal chance, a progressive taxation which kept inequality in check and could finance public services and security for everybody, and a reformed capitalism no longer driven by shareholder value. The world also committed to combat racism and sexism. The spirit of 1945 is still there in the Financial Times call for quote, a new social contract, or for the World Economic Forum planning for, quote, a great reset. And it's there among many progressive think tanks in many countries. However, a 1945 scenario implies that the evil forces of inequality and violence have been decisively defeated. In historical 1945, they had literally been burned to ashes in Berlin and Tokyo. This is unlikely to be the case when this pandemic ends. With the sharpening of geopolitical conflicts as well as of international conflicts, the end of the pandemic crisis is more likely to land us in a 1932 situation, which means a broader range of outcomes, including disastrous ones. Then in 1932, there were three major options. One was progressive social reform, chosen in the United States and in the Scandinavian countries. Another was violent authoritarianism, of which Nazism and fascism was one variant, but more common was a reactionary subcurrent, triumphant in Japan and in Eastern and Southern Europe, with Latin American offshoots. A third variant was an anal conservatism, plodding through a darkening crisis with an upper-class insouciance from a bygone time, for instance in Britain and in France before the interlude of the Popular Front. In a 2020s Green New Deal or social democracy would be a rational option, egalitarian, ecological, non-violent, listening to the climate experts and to a phalanx of distinguished egalitarian economists, the first in the history of that discipline of economics. Above all, it would be a humane politics recognizing, heeding, and committed to the non-privileged people of humankind. Where are the political forces strong enough to carry this out? The answer remains open. There is support all over the world, and there will be struggles for and against. Meaning that there will also be fierce resistance against transforming existing power structures and privileges. The authoritarian, inegalitarian, and violent, if not properly fascist, forces have certainly not been crushed. And we had better not forget that those forces took the world to World War II. Nor that part of the story behind both world wars was a rising power challenging existing world rulers. Germany challenging Britain in 1914 and Japan challenging the United States in the 1930s. Today, the rise of China is seen as an unacceptable threat by the main spectrum of political influencers in the US and increasingly also in the EU, Britain and Japan. And like in 1932, there is today the default option of conservatives of doing little or nothing, but trying to preserve the status quo on a wounded planet, burning with drought, ablaze with wildfires, and drenched by flooding at the same time. After Corona, there will be a decisive moment of choice and commitment.